As the next example, we'll move on to memorization in neural networks. Now, up till this point, we've focused solely on releasing anonymized datasets. You might think, what if we were just trying to release some function of a private dataset? Maybe that would be better because we're not sort of releasing as much information. Well, as we'll see that once again, this is not the case. Even if you just output some restricted amount of data based on the training data, we still can leak information and perform privacy violations. So we're going to consider an investigation of Carlini et al. Called a paper called The Secret Share. But yeah, this was just last year from 2019. And essentially they looked at memorization in neural networks. So it looked at a setting where there was some text corpus Y, the training data, and you train a neural network on it, which results in a generative sequence model, or model F sub theta. So this theta is kind of like the unknown parameters, or the parameters of the model which has been trained. So this is a generative sequence model, and what does that mean? What is it able to do? So it's able to say, given a sequence, given sort of like a sequence of words or characters or something, given a sequence x1 through xn, then it can produce something like the following. It can tell you this p of theta of x1 through xn, and this p, we haven't said what it is, but it's the log perplexity. So this is going to be equal to log base 2 of the probability that x1 through xn, conditioned on our model being f of theta. And this can be rewritten in a nice way, assuming, sort of standard independence arguments. This can be written as the summation of negative log base 2 of the probability of, xi conditioned on the sort of result of the model on the prefix. Sorry, yeah, it doesn't require, say, necessarily independence, but yeah, it requires to be sort of sequentially generated. Okay, so this is the expression, and we call this the log perplexity of a sequence. So what does log perplexity mean? Well, if you investigate it, it says the following, that low perplexity is sort of synonymous with high probability. Sorry. This is synonymous with high probability. And vice versa. If something has very high probability, high perplexity, then it means it's a low probability event. So just to give you some examples of what might be low or high perplexity statements, suppose we had the phrase "Mary had a little lamb." If something is trained on sort of trained on English, then this would be a high probability statement because it's a reasonable sentence, and so it would have a low perplexity. On the other hand, consider something like correct horse battery stapler. This would be a rather low probability sentence because this doesn't really make much sense, and therefore would have a high perplexity. Now, the question is, this sort of isn't a big deal, but let's suppose that, there's just a language model and it was trained in this way, but what if this phrase, correct horse battery stapler, actually appeared in the training data? Then maybe you would imagine that this would become a much higher probability statement, and therefore the perplexity would drop. Now, this might not be such a big deal. Okay, so maybe our language model thinks this nonsense sentence is more likely, but perhaps more seriously, there's more serious secrets that you can imagine might appear in the training data. For example, imagine there was a sentence in the dataset: my social security number is, say, I don't know, this is sort of a placeholder, SSN 078051120. So now, suppose this phrase appeared in the training set. Suppose it was assigned a low perplexity. Then does that mean that it was in the... Can we basically infer based on the perplexity or the scores assigned by this model whether this phrase was in the training data or not? And in particular, if sorry, I lost my train of thought. Essentially, can we locate phrases like this, which were in the training data, but they're actually supposed to be secrets? So there's kind of two questions here. One, like, do neural networks memorize secrets? In fact, if this appears in the training data, will it be assigned a low perplexity? Sort of unusually, because it's kind of a pretty random looking phrase. And two, the other question is, can we find such secrets? If we could find such secrets, then you can identify cases like this and obtain secrets from trained models like this. So they investigate. Carlini et al. They investigate this type of setup in the following way. What they do is they add a phrase called a canary to the data set. So this is reminiscent of the phrase a canary in a coal mine. Coal miners often take a canary down with them because of the carbon monoxide leak. The canary will die, and then that's sort of a signal that they should get out of there. Kind of morbid. But nonetheless, it's called a canary, and they add a canary similar to a phrase like this. This would be what our canary is, which sort of would it give an indication of whether or not the phrase in whether or not it's memorizing things when it's training. Okay, so for example, the question is whether this would have a much lower perplexity compared to semantically similar phrases. For example, what if you took the phrase my social security number is, the exact same starting, but instead it has, a different social security number, 867530900, and it's otherwise the same. Suppose, this was a high perplexity, the original one was a low perplexity, and this one was a higher perplexity, then this would give more of an indication that this one is actually in the training data. So if this would have a lower perplexity, that indicates that the neural network has memorized this phrase, and therefore it's memorizing secrets, and something maybe we want to avoid. We'll note that sometimes on very large data sets, adding something just a single time, so just a single addition of the canary, is insufficient to leave any sort of signal. Imagine you have something trained on a training data set of size 1 billion, then it's unlikely that a single addition of this phrase would cause any sort of difference to the model. Like, it would be minuscule. Okay, so let's be a little bit more quantitative here. So let's be a bit more quantitative. We're going to work, they worked in the following setup. Suppose we had a set of phrases R. So let's say capital R. This is all phrases of the form my SSN or my social security number is, of the appropriate format, XXX-XX-XXXX. So this is a set of phrases, and each of these X's is going to be a digit. And what if we sorted these by increasing order of log perplexity? Sort by log perplexity. And the idea is that if we sort in increasing order, then the most likely phrase will be at the top, and the least likely phrase will be at the bottom. Now, you can imagine that if something is at the top and it has a much, much lower perplexity score than anything else, that's kind of an indication that it's in the data set. Whereas something that appears further down is sort of more hidden, or more, maybe it hasn't been memorized. So we're going to let the rank of a canary be like the ordering in this list? Suppose something appears at the just sort of a random secret, a random phrase of this form would probably fall somewhere in the middle, just if we choose one uniformly at random. So yeah, that's kind of an indication that it's not memorized, whereas things at the top are indication that are memorized. And so with this in mind, the sort of most exposed secrets are the things at the top. So with that in mind, we'll define something known as the exposure. The exposure, I'll just write the expression for it down here, and then we can talk about it a bit. So this is the exposure of a particular phrase, R, that falls into R, the capital R. R is in capital R. And so this is a number which ranges from 0 to log base 2 of R, depending on what the rank is. A large exposure means that it's going to be sort of at the top. And a small exposure means it's lower or in the middle. Yeah, so a exposure of log base 2 of R indicates that it has the lowest log perplexity, and therefore therefore it would have the highest exposure possible. Okay, so now the question is, how susceptible are natural language models to memorizing secrets? And we have two examples here showing that the answer is they are and are not susceptible at the same time to memorizing secrets in this way. So in the left figure, this is based on a very large, very large language model. This is in particular Google Smart Compose. This is essentially, when you start typing an email and you start typing a sentence in Gmail, then it'll try to autocomplete the sentence and suggest what you might want to, how you might want to complete it. Well, this shows that essentially, even if we input a secret, say, 6,000, 8,000, 10,000 times, this would still result in an exposure fairly small, something around 10. I'll point that in this experiment, the size of R is approximately equal to 10 to the 12. So if you sort of do the math and plug it into here, then we would kind of need an exposure of around equals 40 for extraction. And what do I mean by that? I mean that, log base 2 of this quantity is roughly 40. And, like I said, to appear at the top of the list, it would need to have an exposure of basically 40. Therefore, it's very far from appearing at the top of the list, and it's well hidden, in other words. On the other hand, this is the right figure here is with a much smaller data set. Maybe the training data is only of size roughly 100,000, and it uses the exact same my social security number is blah, 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 like this. And you can see that after just, say, 4 or 5 insertions, you can see that the exposure reaches, say, 32 or something like that, the max possible value here. And in particular, this, I claim, is if you take the log base 2 of, how many combinations there are here, this is a log base 2 of R, roughly. So essentially, after just adding it 4 or 5 times, this allows the neural network to memorize it, and it'll appear at the top of the list and expose the secret. So this shows that under certain conditions, yeah, neural networks will actually memorize these secrets which you're trying to hide. In the paper, the authors also give a method for efficient extraction of exposed secrets. Naively, one way of doing it would just be to try all possibilities for computing the SSN, or try all possibilities of what the SSN could be, and then you find which one is large. But they have a more intelligent way of finding these secrets, sort of by a Dijkstra's search type algorithm. So they have ways of also finding these secrets as well. Finally, the authors discuss in their paper how to mitigate such memorization and exposure. In machine learning, there's many ways to prevent overfitting. Like that means where the model learned does not overly represent the training data. Things such as dropout is one approach in neural networks, as well as something known as regularization. And we won't talk about them here, but basically the claim is that these do not work. Even if you do these, then you still have comparable amounts of exposure. They do, however, find that differential privacy, which we'll talk about 2 lectures from now, is essentially the only method that they were able to find which works for preventing exposure and sharing of secrets. That's rather promising sign for differential privacy as a whole. Okay, let's move on to the next and penultimate example. So this example will be a bit shorter, not really too much that I want to say here, but this involves membership inference in genomic studies. So genomic studies or medical studies are very common nowadays. You get some population, you run some statistical analysis on them, maybe take their genes, their genetic information, and make some determinations based on that. And the idea is these are both simultaneously very, very important because this is how we this is how we progress in science and medicine. But at the same time, the data is incredibly sensitive. For example, if somebody participates in a medical study, you wouldn't want this to be publicly divulged, including their medical information. For example, there could be a study which is only open to people with, say, some sort of socially stigmatic disease. If that's the case, then you wouldn't want to reveal the identity of people who participated in such a study. In particular, this would be a gross violation of their privacy if you could. Troublingly, there was a result shown by Homer et al. In 2008. And what they showed is essentially under certain technical conditions, it was possible to re-identify individuals who participate in a study like this based on quantities such as what's technical term known as their minor allele frequencies. So it was rather specific settings. Other people in the area maybe said that these settings were not necessarily met in practice. But nonetheless, this was taken very seriously by the medical and scientific community. In particular, there were drastic measures undertaken by NIH, which is the National Institutes of Health in the US. And previously, they released a number of different statistics, such as, like I said, the minor allele frequencies, as well as various chi-squared statistics, and p-values for various tests. And while these were things that they freely released before, nowadays they are restricted. If you want to get access to these same type of statistics, you can't be just a member of the general public. You have to be a trusted researcher with some background in the field, who comes from maybe a big lab. The point I'm trying to get at here is because of this attack that was discovered by Homer et al., as a result, the NIH restricted free access to the scientific information, this data. And as a result, this really slows down science when there's barriers put up like this. Now, what would solve these types of problems is maybe it's possible to do these genomic studies or compute these statistics in an appropriately privacy-preserving method. If we could do that, then there would be no need to lock these statistics behind walls. And, in some sense, the moral of this story is that if we have appropriate measures of privacy, this can lead to open science, which is, of course, desirable. This is, again, just a short example saying that this happens in and takes effect in very important settings, like genomic studies and medical studies. Cool. Finally, let's move on to the final example of this lecture, which is the Mass Group Insurance Commission example, and this is something from the mid-90s. So this is kind of related to the previous one, where, the Mass GIC, they started a program in the mid-90s where they would allow researchers to request hospital visit records for every state employee at no cost. So this is kind of very similar to, the freedom of information example I mentioned at the beginning of this lecture, but in a slightly different setting. So, okay, what does this info look like? This info looks something like the following. It looks something like an individual, each row in the dataset would have an individual's name, social security number, zip code, as well as their date of birth, maybe their sex, and their condition. So this, of course, is not something you would want to publicly release, all this information like this. So naturally, this was redacted and anonymized in an appropriate way. Say name and social security number was hidden from the data set. And in particular, Massachusetts Governor Bill Weld, he promised, okay, don't worry, we're taking the appropriate measures in order to privatize this data set. So yep, removing these seems private enough, right? Well, of course, by now, you'll probably see that this is not private enough. And this was sort of discovered in a very dramatic attack by LaTanya Sweeney. She was a graduate student in computer science at the time. And she had the following observation. Okay, she didn't observe this specifically at the time, but essentially things like the zip code, date of birth, and sex, these kind of identify an individual in the sense that, you know, how many people do you think share your same zip code, date of birth, and sex? Perhaps not that many. And in particular, this is sort of what was formalized later by Sweeney, but essentially this identifies 87% of the United States uniquely. That is, there's exactly for 87% of the population, if you take their zip code, date of birth, and sex, then there's 0 other people with that same set of pseudo-identifiers, as we'll call them. So this is interesting, but like I said, you know, if you just know zip code, date of birth, and sex, then it doesn't really tell you who has that zip code, date of birth, and sex. You don't know who they are necessarily. But this is where the same type of attack we've mentioned before comes in, and particular side channel attacks, or sorry, not side channel attack, but linkage attacks. For example, what Sweeney did in this case was she bought the voter rolls. This essentially contains each individual's, you know, party affiliation, as well as things like their zip code, date of birth, and sex. So she was able to obtain these at the time for just $20. And she was able to cross-reference these. So what would it have? It would have, say, name, zip, date of birth, sex, and party. So like party affiliation or whatever. And we don't really care about this, so ignore that. But the idea is by performing linkages between these 3 features, then it's actually possible to find the names of individuals and what their condition is. So this seems like a valid attack, and indeed Sweeney was able to pull this attack off. And she actually, in a rather dramatic flair, she sent the governor, Bill Weld, his own medical records, sort of refuting the fact that he said that this would be appropriately private. So that's kind of cool. Now, what do you do? How do you solve this type of problem? Well, what was the issue? The issue was that there's exactly 1 person with each combination of zip code, date of birth, and sex. So let's you know, try to make sure that there's more people with the same set of combinations. And this gives rise to the notion of k-Anonymity, which is one form of anonymity, which was introduced by Samarati and Sweeney. So suppose each point in the dataset has a collection of different features, like let's just take the previous thing. Let's write this again. So some things are just straight up identifiers. So like name, we're just going to totally remove that from the data set because yeah, these are identifiers. They tell you exactly who someone is. Now, some of these columns are going to be sensitive information. For example, this condition is the sensitive information. But everything else here, which is kind of not the sensitive information, but also gives some sort of hint about who the person is, these are going to be called pseudo-identifiers. Right. So what we want is we want the condition or the sensitive information to remain in the data set somehow, because if we got rid of it, that would be eliminating the signal that we want to really communicate. But somehow these pseudo-identifiers, maybe they can be weakened a bit, somehow not give as much information about the individual. And that's kind of what we're going to do. So let's say what the definition is first of k-Anonymity and how we will do this, how we will make a dataset k-anonymous. So this is the definition of k-Anonymity. A dataset is k-anonymous if, for any setting of these pseudo-identifiers, there are at least k-1 other points with the same settings of these pseudo-identifiers. So this might be a bit confusing for now, but let's take a look and see some datasets which have been anonymized, k-anonymized in this way. And here are sort of two datasets which have been k-anonymized, which is, and this is from a paper of Gunt et al. So here we can see that we use the pseudo-identifiers zip code, age, and nationality. And the sensitive thing is their condition, their medical condition. Now you can observe that for every combination of the pseudo-identifiers like zip code, age, and nationality, there are at least 4 people who fit into that to the exact same setting of pseudo-identifiers. So for example, like if somebody has a zip code 13000, is age 28, and they're, say, Canadian, then they could be any of these 4 individuals right here. And you can't really narrow down whether they may have AIDS versus heart disease or what. So this one, just taking a look at it, this data set is 4 anonymized, and this one is 6 anonymized. So this seems like it at least prevents attacks of the previous form, in the sense that you wouldn't be able to tell who Bill Weld was in this data set if he was one of these individuals, because there's at least, say, 3 other people who could be him here, or say 5 other people who could be him here. But this is still vulnerable to several attacks that we saw before. For example, suppose that we knew our 35-year-old friend visited the hospital corresponding to this. Well, let's take a look at the data set. Where would they fall? Then they're not younger than 30, they're not greater than 40, so they would fall into this bin. But the thing is that their condition says that no matter which of these it is, all 4 of these individuals had cancer. So therefore we can say our 35-year-old friend has cancer, sadly. Okay, so that's one type of attack, and just this is kind of a failure in this case. Now, here's another case by putting these 2 pieces of information together. Like if we have both this and this table, and neither one alone is enough to tell us what's going on, but maybe we can use the information jointly. For example, suppose we know someone who's 28 years old, and they visited both hospitals simultaneously, or not simultaneously necessarily, but in 2 separate visits for the same condition. What we can say here is that, okay, they're 28 years old, so therefore they're one of these individuals in this data set, and since age is less than 35 here, they're one of the individuals in this data set. Now what we can see is if we cross-reference this, there's exactly one person who seems to be in both these data sets, the person who has AIDS as a condition. So therefore, this is another attack showing where if some sort of side information that we have will allow us to basically violate the privacy of this individual by finding out their sensitive information. This shows that k-Anonymity isn't really the type of, it's still vulnerable to certain types of privacy violations, which we'd rather avoid. And this was sort of highlighted in a paper by Gunt, Kashi Viswanathan, and Smith. All right, just to wrap up this lecture, what we did today was we showed that essentially ad hoc approaches to data privacy will not necessarily work, and data privacy in general is a rather challenging problem. So in the next lectures, we're going to see more formalizations of how to pull off an attack and what counts as an attack, and then we'll go into how to mitigate certain types of attacks and when we can guarantee privacy.